So, maintenant, on reçoit Samar Younes. Je vais vous la présenter. Vous pouvez applaudir. Okay. So, Samar Younes is a Beirut-born hybrid artist, creative catalyst, and futurist whose work explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and nature through SAMARITUAL, her pluri-disciplinary NYC-based atelier. With a practice deeply rooted in artisanal, cultural, ancestral, and artificial intelligences, Samar crafts visionary narratives that challenge spatiotemporal boundaries and Western-centric paradigms. Her Future Ancestors series epitomizes this ethos, blending biomorphic patterns, textile semiotics, and biophilic design to reimagine identity, belonging, and resilience. An alumna of Central St. Martin's, Samar draws from her transcultural upbringing in Beirut, familial ties to Venezuela, Jamaica, Japan, and the US, and her experiences navigating global cultural hubs. This rich tapestry informs her poetic fusion of art, fashion, and architecture, reshaping cultural narratives and envisioning kaleidoscopic futures. Her work interrogates geopolitical borders while weaving connection reminiscent of the ancient Silk Road, bridging ancestral wisdom with avant-garde speculative visions. Samar's creations blurred the lines between craft and technology, incorporating biomimicry, generative creativity, and modern Eastern representation. Whether designing immersive installation or pioneering hybrid methodologies, she invites audiences to journey through landscapes of memory, possibility, and radical imagination, where the future becomes a transcultural celebration of interconnectedness and resistance. Please welcome Samar Younes.
Thank you. Thanks for the intro. So I'm gonna do this talk in English, if that's okay with you guys, because 3/4 of my life has been spent in Anglo-Saxon, countries. So unfortunately, I lost the knack to speak French as fluently and Arabic, especially when doing these type of presentation. But I have to say that I'm super excited to be here with you because I do these talks very often, specifically in professional settings and universities, and my favorites are usually speaking with students because I wish I had more of these opportunities when I was a student to speak to other people who have had similar experiences or sort of methodology that they can share with me, because it does shape a lot in terms of how you think of yourself, your identity, and your future, specifically as a Levantine and Lebanese individual, and how you kind of view your identity and your career. I'm going to talk about quantum craft. Have you heard of quantum craft or the concept of it? Anyone? Nope? Okay. We're going to talk about what does it mean to build transcultural universe. It sort of is another way to think of when you build a brand or you build a narrative, whether it's personal or for a specific commercial setting, how do you build that brand, thinking about it through multiple intelligence? And we're going to define what those intelligences are. Michelle already did the intro, so I'm not going to go through who I am, but I will sort of, you'll try to understand a little bit more, what does it mean to be a cultural futurist? What does it mean to be a radical world builder? I don't like to put myself in boxes, and nor should you, as far as defining what your title is or what you're studying to define you, because nor your career, nor what you've studied define who you are or what your capabilities are or what you're able to achieve or think about in the future. So a lot of those titles are sort of created to sort of allow people to, easily position you in boxes, but we're talking about how do identities and futures morph, or especially when we are at the cusp of the age of AI, where a lot is going to change as far as how you position yourself or think of yourself in the future, and what are the skills important for the future, and what is your role in this whole paradigm of technology. Let's talk about a little bit of what I do with SAMARITUAL, or at least the questions that I explore. And these are some of the things that I the framework or the question that I kind of ask myself often to guide a lot of what I do with a lot of the work that I do. So how might we reimagine Levantine aesthetic beyond the colonial gaze, not as frozen artifact, but as quantum states of possibilities? What emerges when we treat spaces and garment not as separate domain, but as interconnected vessel for cultural memory? How can we amplify Global South innovation without falling into the trap of tradition versus modernity? How can we transform everyday material into portal for imagination? What happened when we let material speak across medium? For instance, when architecture whispers to fashion, when craft courses with code. How might AI serve not as colonizer, but as collaborator in preserving and evolving cultural knowledge? What new form of cultural expression become possible when we embrace the multiplicity of intelligence, from hand wisdom to algorithmic insight? And when we blur the boundary between habitat, culture, and identity, what new form of belonging emerges? All these are questions I ask myself every day through my practice, through my education lab, as well as through everything that I create and touch. And it's always been something that I thought of from a very young age as we sort of go through my cultural cartography or personal archaeology that I call. And the reason why I'm sharing with you, although there is a lot of personal tidbits here, because each of us has a personal archaeology. It's like a unique fingerprint. This unique fingerprint makes exactly who you are and what your zone of genius is, or what influences, all the different influences and experiences and influences that happen in your life influence directly what you're going to end up doing or what your zone of genius is going to become. As you could see from the 70s all the way through currently right now, all the different things that had shaped who I am, from my upbringing, the environment that I grew up with, the different cultural influences that really shaped me from a sort of, from pop culture to sort of the various kind of cultural sort of and matriarchal influences from my mom and my grandma, to growing up in the war here, to sort of being a rebel and a club kid in the 80s, to basically being always something that I've always gravitated towards, and playing with material and engaging between the intellect and the sort of like hand. Those two things have always been interesting as paradigm. Of course, 80s American pop culture, which was big, you know, if you grew up in the war here in the 80s, and its influence. And my parents, having lived in LA for a while, also brought a lot of that, you know, into our household, and that sort of idea. Celebration as a resistance, you know, in our house, it's always been about like sort of hosting. My mom was the hostess with the mostest. She always made, you know, every kind of meal by hand, and everything was sort of crafted for hours, but also we hosted a lot of parties. And even during the war, the idea of, you know, whether you're going out, which I know a lot of Lebanese do, but, you know, the idea of joy and celebration as a form of resistance, not as a form of shame, is a big part of our fabric and many other communities as well, who have experienced other forms of, whether it's war or oppression. Of course, then my, you know, journey, my career journey, starting here, I did in Alba the 2 years foundation. I don't know if you can hear me, right? My voice carries. The 2 years foundation, at the time, it was a combination of architecture, interior, and visual communication. I think they changed the curriculum since. But I think it was really an incredible 2 years, because we got to really not define ourselves, because I didn't want to choose. I don't want to do architecture, I don't want to do interior, and I don't want to do visual communication. I want to do all of it. But I wasn't interested in permanent spaces. I was interested in both identity, as far as like what you express yourself, what you wear, but also habitat, and how can you sort of provoke cultural and social conversation through those two forms. And then that's why I went to St. Martin's in London, because I knew, like, from an education perspective, they were, you know, kind of disruptive in the way they sort of approach multidisciplinary kind of curriculums. But also I was able to, through scenography, because studying art installation or anything cultural didn't really exist at the time, I was able to sort of, you know, create more ideas around narrative environment and how you sort of create story and tell stories through environment, utilizing all these pieces. And then, of course, my journey from London to the US, having lived in Miami for 8 years initially and being immersed in the South American culture from my youth, because my mom was born in Venezuela and she influenced that a lot, you know, being Lebanese, but she and my grandma were there for 10 years, so that was a huge influence in our household, but also it felt like home. Miami felt a lot like home because having sort of that influence since childhood. The reason why I'm also walking you through all this, you're going to see a lot of those influences in my career and my output as well, and what I do. And the expression, and the visual expression, and my aesthetic sort of signature is very influenced by all these kind of tidbit. Because again, who you are is not necessarily your identity, how it's defined as, you know, if you're an Arab, if you think of yourself as a Levantine or a Lebanese, it's not as flat as, you know, what does that mean? It's not about nationalism or, you know, كلنا للوطن, you know, mindset. It's more about what is that nuance of identity, what makes your identity unique to you, because it is all these influences. We come from layers of aesthetic influences because of layers of civilization. Those civilizations come through this. We were in the past of the Silk Road, where many cultures have passed, who have influenced who we are, as well as, of course, the colonial paradigm, who kind of dictated that what is deemed cool is everything that's Eurocentric or Western-centric. So we always kind of, at least in our generation, would identify or would reject a lot of other influences beyond the European influences because that's who we thought was cool. And then it's only through like a personal journey of identity and being a child of the diaspora, living 29 years abroad, you know, being married to somebody who is from Jamaican heritage and sort of living in New York and Brooklyn, where, you know, it's the birthplace of hip hop, which is also a huge influence in, you know, my personal kind of aesthetic, and because it speaks a lot of the sort of struggle, the idea of resistance and celebration as well. Through my personal journey of breast cancer as well, that's what sort of made me drawn into neuroaesthetic and how aesthetic influence a lot of the work that I do. And then last but not least, because I have worked a lot with global brand for 20 years, as an artistic director or VP creative with big teams made out of multiple creatives, mentorship became like a sort of second nature, second kind of instinct. So a lot of, though, when you build brands in general, you have to think of their physical footprint as well as their digital footprint. And that's what sort of brought me into the technology world. And how do we build brand universes that are both environment that you can sort of experience in the physical realm, but also experience in a very similar way in the digital realm, whether you're thinking about it as simply as the internet through the different social channel, or, you know, more kind of holistically as far as the future, like, you know, if you think of the metaverse or other sort of portals that are digital portals. So we're going to start to talk about how these various forms or this personal cartography have influenced this idea of hybrid intelligence. And the four intelligence framework we're going to speak about is ecological, ancestral, artisanal, and artificial intelligence. And through these various sort of paradigm, we're going to discuss each one, how does it behave and how does it influence a lot of the project that you guys do. Because the future is about very much thinking holistically through various forms of intelligences. And funny enough, it's only when I started to use a lot of artificial intelligence that I kind of started to understand more deeply how we as human have a unique form of intelligence that's different than how the artificial intelligence behave, and what we can sort of bring from the world of computing and sort of advanced technology and how it can work to our advantage, and what we as human are going to have uniquely still positioned at a skill that's needed for the future. So we're going to start with the first form of intelligence, which is the ecological intelligence, which is obviously nature's wisdom. So when we talk about nature's wisdom, it's thinking about learning from the natural system by observing, and sort of also by learning from how, that ecological system behaves, thinking through sustainable approaches, natural system understanding by also studying and sort of like doing deep research around a lot of how these natural systems behave, how the species interconnect through that natural habitat, and what is our role, learning from these kind of behavioral symbiosis in terms of how it impacts how, when we build, how does our intervention affect that species that we sort of come into contact with, and then of course, what are the ecological methods that could apply across mediums when you are working with different mediums, and what is the environmental adaptation of such intelligence. So I'm going to show you some examples of that through some of the work that I've done in the past. And a lot of it is going to apply directly to some of the work that I've done because I can easily speak to it. But there is millions of, obviously, examples of how you sort of think through that ecological intelligence framework. And of course, these particular examples use various forms of intelligence, but the core is the ecological framework. And a lot of the examples that you're going to see here are from my days at Anthropology, where I was there for 10 years as an artistic director, which is a lifestyle retailer, and from Coach, where I was there for about 7 years as the director of visual experience. So what you see here is thinking through waste and materiality from ordinary to extraordinary. What does that mean? If we think of ancient cultures, specifically cultures that are part of our heritage and our region and our part of the world. Think of the March people that are in Iraq. And I don't know if you're familiar with them, where they kind of do reed structure. They're weaving through, they live on the marches. They use the reed in the marches. They weave it. They build habitat. They build it as a community because craft has always been the first kind of pillar of community working together. And this ecological intelligence, obviously married with craft, which we'll talk about in the next section, were the first builders, they were the first architects, they were the first engineers. So thinking through what does it mean as far as like connecting with nature, but also using natural material symbiotically with the habitat. So in the case of what you see, a lot of the example, or how it manifests through a lot of these techniques that are adapted, are all the examples that you see here are waste material that have been repurposed from ordinary to extraordinary, and also blending the sort of disciplines where architecture becomes fashion or fashion becomes architecture. Because as I said, the idea of habitat and the idea of embodiment or sort of identity, for me, are very interconnected. So here, for instance, this skirt that I have created was all made out of disposed shingles. And I don't know if you're familiar with the material. It's a wood, like, shingle is made out of shavings of trees. And a lot of it is usually the waste material of when they process trees. They create shingles to do roofing. And for me, architecture and material have always been super interesting to influence fashion, because the idea of structure and fashion has always been how we even dress ourselves as a culture. It's always been about like sort of the silhouettes that are more voluminous and sort of structural, that really kind of dictated a lot of the forms that we sort of inhabit. So here it's utilizing a lot of the waste shingles that I had collected through various sort of waste yards to create this kind of material and prototype the skirt that had to sort of be a prototype and engineered in a way to work for 120 stores. So what does that mean when you think holistically, ecological intelligence plus transport plus how does that work in the realm of multiple forms? You're not doing a one-off prototype. You have to think through the prototype and how does that work through multiple regions, through multiple geographies. And those 100 stores were not all located in the US. But when you think ecological intelligence, you have to think of the carbon footprint. You have to think of how does it transport, how does it ship. So to me, it was, I needed to kind of get rid of the idea of the carbon footprint. So transport and any of that should be completely irrelevant because I wanted people to use local material or use something shingle adjacent. So what I shared in the prototype was more the methodology and how to build this, utilizing local material so we eliminate the carbon footprint. And what they have is the intelligence of how to build this through local material to execute in the same way and the same kind of aspirational storytelling. This was for a holiday kind of rollout, and it was more of on the sort of aspirational kind of end. Next to it, the photo with the sheep, as you could see, animals have always inspired a lot of my work as sort of is all form of biomimicry. And this was a window for Loro Piana, and I don't know if you're familiar, it's a quiet luxury brand, and sometimes not everything they do they kind of behave ethically with. However, a lot of the creative team that are there that I've known for a long time, they try really hard to utilize the material and the intelligence through an ecological framework and think ethically how they can navigate the brand. So I worked with the head creative to do this window rollout that was global, and we kind of celebrated the idea of these sheeps because they were known for cashmere, and we wanted to kind of re-celebrate and re-center sheeps as both symbols of virtue but also good luck sort of symbols, so we called the window boombas. And a lot of the material that was used in order to create those boombas was waste cashmere material that was sort of rewoven through a specific methodology. And because cashmere weighs very lightly and can be shipped very easily, so a lot of the actual execution happened through the local narrative. So again, footprint is really minimal. It's the same idea through many of the projects that you see here, whether it's this wild beast hand that was sort of the idea of kind of connecting with nature. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Where the Wild Things Are, or thinking holistically, how do we kind of bring nature into our like habitat, but how do we sort of utilize material in ways that feels as interesting as possible. And what makes these very successful and sort of in the realm of luxury, it's the sort of preciseness in how they were crafted. And then lastly, this example up there from anthropology was all utilizing sort of inspired by the Louise Nevelson framework of how she sort of puzzles a lot of pieces. It's utilizing a lot of waste furniture that was disposed at thrift stores. And again, the footprint is minimal because everybody can execute it locally, and how they can, utilize this kind of waste material and repurpose it in extraordinary ways. Next is ancestral intelligence. So when we talk about ancestral intelligence, is the living culture memory of all the layers, and that cartography that I showed you earlier, the personal cartography, is my ancestral sort of intelligence, plus all the stories and oral histories and storytelling method that I have inherited from the elders that I grew up around, or people that were older than me, and everything that I've read around, the cultural the culture that I'm interested in and the culture that I've grew up in. Another form of ancestral intelligence is the ritual spaces and community exchange. One of the biggest ways to sort of think about ancestral intelligence is the ancestors always operated as communities. They never did things as solo endeavors. So when they built, when they sort of thought holistically, when they made rituals, all of it was for the good of the community to safeguard themselves, because if they didn't, they wouldn't survive, as alone survivors. And then next is the intergenerational knowledge cultural transfer. Because, the ancestors didn't necessarily have access to what we have, an encyclopedia on, in our hands, like the phones, a lot of the knowledge transfer did happen through these intergenerational kind of systems. And, while you're alive, and what I encourage you to do is try to safeguard a lot of that knowledge that you have while your ancestors are still living. Get the oral stories, get the heritage, get the sort of, the knowledge that sort of has immersed a lot of your footprint and your genetic DNA. And then, last but not least is the cultural symbols and transcultural pattern that emerge. So these are your brain is neuroplastic for a reason. Everything that is sort of kind of lived through it immerses this kind of your DNA and these influences, and they kind of become permanent sort of prints into your sort of memory and your taste. That's how you cultivate your taste level. And it's everything that you pass and sort of are exposed to over and over become these kind of transcultural patterns that sort of make your point of view. What are some of those hybrid intelligence ancestral examples that manifested in some of my work? I'll talk to you about two sort of specific example in terms of one, which is an older brand, which is about 80 years old, which is Coach, which is a leather house. And then Schofield is more of a very new brand, which is no longer in existence, but it was a 2-year-old kind of brand, very much in the age of technology. And why I want to draw both of those examples, so you can understand how did the ancestral intelligence kind of help inform a lot of the decision that I sort of made for a lot of those brands' universe as it was built. Starting with Coach. As you could see, Coach is a New York-based brand, and when it was first founded, it was founded by actually a woman who was one of the innovators. She basically invented the idea of how do women, like if you think of a lot of the women back in the days, especially in an urban environment like New York, you had to sort of be on your foot a lot and carry things just like anywhere else, but it had to be like very practical when you're in a city or in your urban environment. So when she invented the handbag, she wanted to invent it to look like her, plastic bag, shopping bag. They say, invention is the mother of ingenuity. What she invented was the classical Coach bag, which is in the shape of a bucket. And that was the first of its kind. If we think of like the early 40s, 50s, nobody had these type of bags. It was usually a very small purse, very demure, because you had to be very demure at the time as a woman. So she sort of revolutionized the idea of how women should behave in a modern environment. In addition to inventing this bucket bag where you could put everything in, she wanted to make sure that all the hides and the leather that she was using was wasted material, and it was done through the most refined craftsmanship. And that's what differentiates, a regular brand, I guess, from a sort of a luxury behavior. Because luxury to me is more about craftsmanship and beautifully created things with care and a lot of time. So when you think holistically about the story of Bonnie Cashin, who kind of was the pioneer of Coach, she also invented, the snap closure. I don't know if you guys are familiar. A lot of the bags now have this kind of snap turn lock closure. This turn lock closure, how she invented it was based on the convertible cars where they used to close and open. They used to have the snap closure, so she took that same principle and translated it in a bag. Again, how other discipline or your environment informs a lot, identity and embodiment and fashion and vice versa. So the story of Coach, in its 75th anniversary, and when I was tasked with how do I kind of utilize the 75 years archive, they have an amazing archive in history, to really think about all the brand codes that make Coach, to think about all the ancestry of Coach, how it was born, what it was influenced by, and all the different things that make up the brand. And there was multiple kind of brand codes that emerge, or brand DNA, just like, individual DNA emerges. And one of which is obviously New York, and what signifies New York a lot. And we'll talk about it through some of those examples. It's also the atelier, which was this atelier concept, which was a leather craftsmanship concept. And it's also about this kind of effortless, super modern, and cool woman who is strong, but also a bit of a rebel. So all about this influence of Americana, because she was also a traveler, and she liked to sort of like think through a multi sort of cultural perspective. So the subway kind of idea that sort of became one of the signature kind of pop-ups and sort of like temporary stores, as well as windows, fur coach, was the idea of this New York subway, which, is very distinct, has very specific details. It's not like other subways. And of course, in the 80s, when it was sort of the emergence of pop art with Basquiat and Andy Warhol, there was a lot of graffitis and cultural expression that was made on the subways. So a lot of the subways manifestation, whether they popped up in different cities, because again, when I was working with Coach, it was 400 stores globally across all cities. So how does it adapt culturally for different cities? So when we were at KaDeWe in Berlin, it was the color palette that sort of adapted to the local kind of city, but keeping the ancestral DNA. When it went to sort of Elaine Crawford here, which was in Shanghai, it had to adapt through, the graffiti and everything was done in a lot of Mandarin and such, so they can sort of adapt it to the local, but thinking through the ancestral framework. And of course, the infamous rats that are all over the subways in New York, how do you sort of create kind of cultural relevancy and thinking holistically through a brand code that feels tongue-in-cheek, hence the sort of leather mouse that you see here that was crafted out of leather to give homage to the craftsmanship, the leather craftsmanship of Coach. Same with a lot of the examples that you see here, like this giant dinosaur, which was about the height of this auditorium, is made out of 200 defaulted bags and old bags that were sort of disposed and sort of created this kind of signature style of Coach, because the dinosaur became one of our brand codes, being that it has history and sort of how it moved through a prehistoric pattern. The sort of leather and sort of detailing of what you see in the cactus kind of signifies the idea of road trips in Americana. The homage to Elvis here of sort of like, or Americana here was old Chevys, and sort of the idea of, it's all storytelling that links back to the brand code. And then the second example is the store design and developing store code for a brand that's entirely new, that does not have archival history. How do you build archival history and ancestral intelligence for a brand that's brand new? If you're building a brand, how do you build history? How do you build relevancy? So this is the example of Schofield that you see in the first row that's here, and basically it was about utilizing the context in which where the brand is born and how does it contextualize within this particular paradigm. The brand is born in New York, so obviously a lot of the framework was New York, but it was not a regular retail store. This was a retail store that combined a hospitality concept as well as an art exhibit concept. So what I wanted to do, because the store, the first store in which Schofield was created, it used to be actually shelter for women. And it was one of the first animal hospitals as well in the city, where they used to treat horses. That's why a lot of the architecture of the space was like that. So as an homage to being a shelter for women, thinking through that ancestral framework, I created the art gallery that it's in this space, because they also discovered a lot in that store, some artwork from Basquiat in the walls of the space. So I wanted to sort of have the sort of a gallery in the shape of a woman bust that you see here. So that's a gallery that's in the shape of a woman bust, and the engineering of it to try to get it as a woman bust, to give an homage to both womanhood as well as the matriarchal figure that made the space, was one that became one of the brand code of Schofield, as well as mixing old and new element. Because it sort of intersected a lot with technology, we use a lot of old brand code with surreal, oversized, new brand codes. All right. How are we doing with time? Okay, got it. Ça va, that's good. Next, we're going to talk about artisanal intelligence, which is the knowledge through making. And the knowledge through making is exactly what your hand intelligence is, which is so different than your brain intelligence. Because if you don't understand or have not worked with various material, you do not have material intelligence. And I'm not only talking about artisan and craftsman, I'm talking every single material that you think about. A hairdresser has an amazing material intelligence of hands. A cook has an amazing material intelligence of food, and so on and so forth. So understanding material behavior is paramount to gaining artisanal intelligence. So if you haven't explored and worked with material, especially earlier in your career, I highly advise you sort of play with the idea of how does the material behave? How does it dictate? How does it move? Because you can't bend the material to behave a certain way and start to design on paper for it if you don't understand how it behaves. How does it sort of interact with the environment, and how is it built, and how does it sort of hold up? You know, as I said, the craftsmen or the artisans were the first builders. They were the one who sort of were the first engineers, were the first architect. And because of the colonial paradigm, they kind of put craft as something that is inherently not as elevated. So to me, craft has always been more important than art in a lot of ways, because without amazing craftsmanship, you cannot have none of the stuff that we have right now. So if you think of traditional craft technique and how those have evolved, or how those were pillaged and stolen through the colonial framework to become works of art, and there are multiple examples, is pretty astonishing. How this hand-mind connection, when you are working with certain material that evoke what I sort of call neuroaesthetic, which is an important principle in terms of how those material behave, and that how this aesthetic of the material and the sort of colors and textures of the material directly impact your mind, hence your well-being. You know, there is a study that says if you are in a green environment for 10 minutes, your stress level is reduced immediately by 30% just by being around a green environment for 10 minutes. And I'm not talking fake plastic green. I'm talking real live material. Once you understand more the sort of like well-being, body, and physical connection and embodied connection to material, you'll understand more how you can create spaces that not only thought-provoke and sort of create culture, but also create well-being. Of course, the cultural making practices that are inherited from generation to generation, there are also preservation method. There are also resistant method. Think of the G-bend quilts that used to be made by a lot of the southern kind of black folks who used to kind of quilt as a collective, and they used to be able to tell their stories because they couldn't express their stories, being that it was during a lot of the period of slavery. They were able to do it through quilt making as a collective practice, but also as a form of storytelling. And then, of course, modular engineering. If you don't understand material behavior, you're unable to think about it and design things that last. When we think about circular, it starts from not only the material, but also how it's engineered so it can break down easily and not end in a landfill. From thinking, if you're a great artisan, you're not only, some of your skills is not only the tactility of the skill, but also having patience, building perseverance, and also having attention to detail. So it's all these details that really kind of elevate the craft and make craftsmen and artisans so amazing, and that's why I'm sort of so obsessed with artisans all my life. So this is some examples of artisanal intelligence through some of my work. And here I'm going to show you two windows, one that was in Colette and one that was at a pop-up of Colette next to it in New York. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Colette in Paris. It used to be like a really cool kind of eclectic store. And I worked with an artist called Gary Baseman who does a lot of these kind of like offbeat cartoonish drawings, but they all are based on these rituals offerings with these characters like Buster and you know, all these different things. And what he wanted to do was do a shrine to honor sort of like Buster as sort of this ritual. But I didn't want to do it and create a window specifically when it comes to doing it at Colette and presenting the new collection of Coach in a way that feels really flat. So it wasn't going to be printed because that's not going to make it really interesting. Instead, I kind of worked with an artisan who was an embroidery artist to recreate his drawing through an embroidering framework. And the banner that you see that's behind the sort of, you know, table that has the sort of sculpture of Buster took about 250 hours to create. Everything was hand embroidered, and it's almost drawing with a needle. So the idea of this hand intelligence of how you can transform a simple drawing through this artisanal practice where you are actually really exploring the different embroidery techniques, whether it's flat, whether it's fluffy, whether it has cross-stitching, all of which make up that universe. And from afar, you might see it a bit more flat, but when you come closer, it's the idea of these various layers of discovery from far to closer in order to sort of reinforce the artisanal intelligence. The other example here, this was all hand loomed, this giant sweaters. Also, it was kind of like almost like a shrine to Buster, sort of honoring this kind of like monster slash, animal creature. And then last is all these, the feast that you see, the Feast de Babette that you see here that was a pop-up. All these also were made out of food material that were sculpted at different scale, in which we worked with the artisan not only to utilize food material, but also infuse these food material with different scent to tie you back to the spices and all the different things that we kind of are trying to sculpt. So it came back to kind of bring in full force the idea of all these sensory kind of feeling into that perspective here. Last but not least is artificial intelligence. And why do I work with artificial intelligence? Because I know you're going to have many questions on that, which we're going to talk about. But, as I said when I shared my personal cartography, I am almost 50, and I have been through breast cancer, and I used to make a lot of things by hand and utilize a lot of my body to create a lot of things, spending hours on ladder, have discs and injury from top to bottom, utilizing a lot of my hands. When the emergence of, or when I became sort of a VP creative and such, I wasn't doing a lot of things by hand, but I was directing a lot of the projects. And that was not creative to me. When you're directing projects, it's not like you're creating projects, right? There is creativity, of course, involved, but it's different. I wanted to sort of have the opportunity to play with the material the same way that I used to play with the material when I had the ability to sort of work for hours on a project with my hands. When artificial intelligence emerged, or generative AI, it was actually my sister, who's in the audience, who kind of told me, try it out. I think you're going to really like it. That was about maybe 3 years ago. And at the beginning, I had resistance to it because a lot of the generative AI was kind of creating a lot of worlds that didn't really fit my aesthetic. It was very dystopian, very much embedded in that digital aesthetic. And a lot of the challenges that I had when I was building digital spaces in addition to physical spaces, or, directing a lot of my teams to kind of build on computers through different programs from Rhino to etc., they lacked a lot of the sensitivity and the artisanal intelligence that I liked from creating by hand. So it was only up until I've created over 50,000 images and sort of learned how to hack the system for my advantage and actually start looking at data as another form of material. Because data and ethno-aesthetic acumen, which is knowledge, which is all the other knowledge that I mentioned before, artisanal, ancestral, as well as ecological, is another material, if you think about it, in the world of and the age of AI. So the other thing that I've learned working with artificial intelligence is that how it analyzes patterns and behavior is very different than how our brain looks at patterns and material, because we always embed a lot of our lived experience and our emotion when we're looking at patterns and analytics. Versus there is this collaborator, which is this artificial collaborator that looks at pattern in a very mathematical way, because that's how the system is programmed. It's programmed to look at data and analyze images in a very mathematical way. So what if you're able to have a collaborator where you have the emotional, ecological, artisanal, and ancestral intelligence with somebody who looks at data in a very mathematical way, including anything that you feed, and you're able to actually push your craft and elevate it even further. And that is sort of one of the possibility of creating with artificial intelligence. The other thing I found really helpful is, and that's obviously, a fine line, is that you can create a lot of ideas when you're doing it in the physical space, but a lot of the time it involves so much kind of labor and effort, and you're unable to push your ideas further enough. And also in a lot of prototyping, there is a lot of waste and a lot of waste material. So it's balancing how much GPUs you're using to think of the ecological footprint of artificial intelligence with the amount of time and the waste that you're creating when you're prototyping something in the physical space, and all the labor and effort that comes about it. So you're able to really think holistically about your entire culture footprint and data set analysis through this framework. And some of the examples I'm going to show you, which is this latest kind of exhibit that I just did in Dubai at the Future Forum, which was the biggest kind of gathering of futurists, where I utilized this idea of hybrid intelligence with AI, where I showed my Future Ancestors series, which is this transcultural portrait that imagined futures of the global south, but not through a colonial gaze, but through this very kind of avant-garde gaze that is immersed through our ancestry and reclaiming what is that versus us kind of thinking through their gaze and how it's sold to us. But I also combined with it a piece that's completely handmade, which is this textile sculpture, in which I started a lot of my prototyping and a lot of my work in order to get this sculpture to be what it is through artificial processes. So a lot of this was a camel cover initially that I was sort of thinking, and I wanted to sort of give an homage to camels, because camels were the first knowledge transporters. They used to be able to carry 800 pounds on their back, and they were the first vehicle of transportation during the Silk Road. So if you think about them, they're almost like the first kind of machines, like, the first computers or the first, telephones, because they transported knowledge from one region to another and sort of immersed that knowledge by having all the goods on their back. And that knowledge came in the form of goods and, of course, a lot of oral stories, because they transported people as well. So that's why I wanted to give homage to this majestic creature, and instead of giving it homage in an Orientalist way, like a lot of the Western kind of interpretation of camels, I wanted to give it this culture strata, which kind of gives it the idea of layers of history using dead stock fabric. Everything was pleated by hand, everything was created by hand, but all the prototyping and ideation was done through artificial intelligence. And then I sort of, as I was doing mini prototypes and mini sort of like framework of it, I would go back and forth between the machine and the hand to kind of push it further and sort of evolve it further. So this is kind of like how you can think of weaving the different intelligence system methodology by observing and collecting, synthesizing and imagining, and implementing and evolving. So in observe and collect, you're thinking of how you map the cultural stories and spatial tradition that are ancestral, how you document techniques and material knowledge that are artisanal, and how you gather environmental pattern and natural systems that are ecological, and then use AI to analyze and recognize those patterns. How you can blend traditional practices with digital tools. The dots went all over the place in this presentation. Allow AI to suggest unexpected combination, test idea through physical prototyping, let nature involve spatial relationship, and identify emerging pattern across systems. And lastly, how you can implement and evolve. It's creating spaces that adapt and grow, build-in rooms for community input, include traditional and new material, use technology to monitor and adjust, and allow for natural evolution. How does it age? How does it evolve? How do we sort of breathe life in it and layers of different kind of time footprint? In a lot of my future EduLab, this is kind of the imagine or the speculative creative ecosystem that I imagine the future and the age of AI to be. Is we're going to have, artificial collaborator, artificial kind of system, as well as real life systems. And humans are not going to go anywhere. Actually, they're going to become more important, but they're going to shift in their role. So your technical expertise might not be as necessary as far as technical expertise that's needed on the machine, but artisanal expertise is going to become even more valuable, and artisanal as well as our ecological and ancestral intelligence is going to become even more important. So this ecosystem, it has the creative synthesizers, the ethical navigator when using AI, the AI partners, the artisanal integrators, the cultural interpreters and tastemakers, and the AI and language architect that allow you to even further kind of utilize a lot of the knowledge systems to further kind of use them into your kind of ecosystem. So what is the future skills in the age of AI? What do you got? I mean, I'm going to talk them through a little bit, and then we'll talk about them in the Q&A. But first and most importantly is the mindset, and that is uniquely human. The AI is not playful. It does not have the sort of, raw inclination of humans. If you think of a child and in their wilderness, one of the most important things they do, and one of the things that's been kind of hijacked from us as adults, is our ability to imagine and play. So what we're going to be able to reclaim in the age of AI is the playful and creative thinking mindset, where imagination has no boundaries. The second thing is the methodology, which is data prompting literacy. So it's important to have literacy in terms of how you're hacking the system and how you're actually prompting and how you're mixing this data in order to utilize all these intelligence framework. And lastly is the most important skill of the future, which is ethno-aesthetic acumen. In other words, taste level. Your taste is that unique footprint that I spoke about at the beginning, which is the cultural relevancy, the ethical evaluation, the vision, the aesthetic sensibility, and the contextual understanding. This is cultivated. Your taste level, you're not born with somebody has more taste than the other. It's actually cultivated by what you're exposed to. The more you kind of actually expose yourself to from material, artisanal, a cultural kind of framework, the more you're cultivating and elevating this taste level in order to refine it and have your own footprint in this idea of augmented creativity and collective intelligence. A few more slides to finish. I'm looking at time. We're good because we started a little bit late. Am I still good on time? Yes? Okay, good. So in this hybrid creativity framework, the mapping of multiple intelligence, which is the cultural memory mapping, material knowledge inventory, digital tool assessment, and ecological assessment analysis, these are basically the framework in which you have to think about when you're thinking about this hybrid creativity framework. The culture pattern recognition, which are so important. In this case here, you see an example of the flower man of Saudi Arabia. Most of us, when we grew up, we thought Saudi Arabia is a desert. There is nothing but desert. But actually, there is an amazing side to Saudi Arabia, which are the mountain area where you have these flower men that live there that sort of kind of, put to shame and sort of completely blur the idea of this patriarchal system that is very predominant in Saudi. They actually put flowers in their head. And you can look them up. This is obviously not their image. This is like a sort of interpretation that I did with artificial intelligence. But if you look at the flower men of Saudi Arabia, you're going to be able to see in this region called Qasim how amazing they are. And when you think of cultural pattern recognition, is basically disrupting this kind of Western gaze or colonial gaze in terms of how we look at culture, and also thinking of our personal heritage pattern that is discovery-like and anthropological, not just surface level or what we've been fed in our education system, which is very colonial. So think of community narrative, environmental influences, and future aspirations. Next is our universe expansion. So when you're building your own brand or brands in the future, how do you expand that universe? How you think about it in terms of not something that's static, but something that breathes and keeps evolving. Because great brands are great storytellers, but stories keep evolving. So you have to think of a growth strategy. You have to think from a modular adaptation. You have to think of community as co-creation and feedback to be able to help you grow, and be able to think of how you incorporate technology where technology becomes invisible, but it's also helping you power and superpower your potential as well as your capabilities, and the ecological evolution and the symbiosis of the ecological ecosystems. And last but not least is the narrative development. So what are the building blocks of this narrative development? How are you developing this story? What are your culture touch point? What are your spatial storytelling touch point? What is the temporal, as in the history rhythm? And what is the sensory experience that had informed those narrative development? So these are some of the sort of material, superposition that I sort of leave you with as question. What emerges when we treat material not as fixed substances, but as quantum possibilities? How might we think of different form of intelligence to collaborate with and unlock new state of matter, as I was talking about the data as a form of intelligence, and what happened when we let material dream across medium. This is, for instance, an example of feast. Food is another form of material. How can you sort of rethink of that material, not in its original way in terms of how you use food, but how can you subvert the material to rethink about it through a different paradigm as a form of art and cultural expression? So the two systems that I always like to refer, to finish the conversation with is, and that's how we want to think about AI and build towards AI, which are two knowledge systems. The two models of material knowledge, you have the Silk Road system and you have the colonial system. The biggest difference between them, if we think of the idea of collective intelligence, is the Silk Road system used to have reciprocable knowledge flow, local interpretation, adaptation, value multiplication, and collective evolution. So knowledge was a common, it was available for all, and it flowed between different civilizations and different countries and different places, different borders, but it also informed a lot of the local without basically being extractive. It just highly influenced wherever it was passing. Versus, so it was very much of a knowledge exchange that flows back and forth, because it was a circular route as well. Not a literal circle, but it was a circular route. The colonial system, on the other hand, how it sort of came about, it's an invasive system that is a monopolizing system, because it sort of is based on extraction and appropriation, flattening of culture pattern. So when I say flattening of identity, when you think of yourself as Lebanese, what does that mean? What is your personal experience as Lebanese? Because your country doesn't only define you or where you're born. What is the centralized control? And then also the value concentration and individual profit. So the colonial system, and where we don't want, like for instance, the future to be or AI to be, is become the system where it's actually going to individual profit. So far, a lot of the sources or the sort of AI system have been open source in a lot of ways, but they are going towards potential colonial system. And it's only if we're involved in them to make sure they remain knowledge commons that they won't become also colonial systems that are extractive, that have destroyed so much of the global south. So this is what I sort of want to leave you with, which is the universe builder's task isn't about crafting new worlds, but it's about how we treat material as carrier of culture memory and portals of future imagination. What new forms of collective knowledge become possible? How might we craft exchange system that multiply value rather than extract it? So these are some of the questions that you sort of can think about, you know, in your practice, and how you sort of think through a lot of what you do when you're thinking through this hybrid intelligence framework, to sort of collaborate with it and think about it in a different, not through hierarchical models. And how might Lebanese design thinking inform more equitable system of material exchange? In a lot of your practice, you want to think of impact. It's not what you're doing right now, but what impact am I leaving? It doesn't matter if it takes forever. It doesn't matter if you're leaving a tiny impact. But if your development, and if your research, and if your methodology leaves some sort of impact and some sort of cultural knowledge that is kind of being able to be passed down to future generation that will be able to better it, then that is an impact. So you always want to think of impact beyond anything else. And I think that's about it.
Thank you, Samar, for this very, very, very rich and quite complex presentation. I think it will take some time for the things to sunken in our students' minds. I find really fascinating the way you use the immaterial matter to weave it into the matter. And in that sense, it makes sense that you're using AI, because it's a huge tool and source of immaterial matter. And I have questions on this, but first I'm going to let our students, if they have questions. No questions?
Crickets.
Okay, my question regarding this is, it's very simple, it's really almost technical. I think you have quite a stability because you've been through all of this and you have your own experience. And our students, they don't have this maturity yet. So it's really tempting, I think, for them while using AI to lose sight of their goal, right? So, because it's so broad and it offers so many possibilities that sometimes, when I try to tell them this, don't give your power to the tool. Like as a designer, how do you keep your power as a designer? So what would be the advice you would give our students to use AI without losing their power as designers or architects?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for asking that, because that does come up often. And you're right. You can't develop a point of view through artificial intelligence. You develop your point of view through the other hybrid form of intelligence, which are ecological, cultural, artisanal. So if you're relying on AI right now at a young age only, it's going to lead your output, versus you're not going to be able to control it and really have a point of view. Because AI, you can't control the aesthetic unless you have an aesthetic, unless you have a point of view. So if you don't know what your point of view is, which is going to keep evolving, but it has to be anchored in real life experience. So in order to develop a point of view, you have to spend equal time, if not more time, cultivating your personal paradigm and your personal kind of story and what you're interested in, and use right now at this early stage of your career more AI as experimentation. I'm interested in this and this. What if I combine all these together? I'm interested in all these things, but I don't know what patterns. Am I interested in all these things that have nothing to do with one another? How can I find what pattern kind of marry all of them, and what kind of speaks to me and my experience? So you're able to use it as a sparring partner, that you're able to sort of help you understand yourself and build your point of view a bit better earlier in your career, but not let it dictate and tell you what it is. You need to give it enough perspective and point of view based on what your exact aesthetic and ideas and way of thinking is initially in order to cultivate it.
Questions?
So I'm familiar with your work in AI. I'm the sister. But for those who are not, we haven't seen a lot of the AI images. And I know you focused a lot on identity and experience. But I know also that when you spoke about data as material, that there's also the bias of data. And I know that the work you put into overcoming, let's say, these biases in order to be able to create with the cultural references or the experiences that you're trying to convey. And so I wonder if you could speak about, like what you encountered as these deadlocks initially with these biases and how you managed to counter them.
Also great question, and that does get asked a lot because data is biased, specifically if a data is predominantly being fed through the knowledge common that's now mostly digital, because that's how AI models are trained, and they trained on data in the form of text and imagery and other based on what's available on the web, basically scraping the web, scraping archives. But who is basically in control of how our story is told on the web? It's basically whoever wins, or the predominant Western kind of systems. They are the one who are dictating how we're supposed to look, how we're supposed to be, what our identities are. So I did a very simple experiment with Hello Kitty. So I did Hello Kitty as a very traditional sort of wearing a very traditional, let's say, Syrian outfit. Hello Kitty, wearing a very traditional sort of Saudi outfit. Hello Kitty wearing a very traditional Brazilian outfit. And then I did Hello Kitty wearing a very traditional French outfit. So when we talk about what traditional is and what stereotype, I actually didn't use traditional, I used stereotypical. And what emerges in this experiment when I first was working with a lot of the tool is the bias in terms of how it stereotypes us will blow your mind. For example, when it kind of does anybody like from Iraq, if you say Iraqi or Palestinian, you're gonna see a Hello Kitty not only wearing, not only wearing the traditional outfit, but also having a gun in her hand or sort of an M16. So the bias that's embedded in the system will blow your mind. So you need to outsmart the system, because the system think of archetype. How it's trained by archetype. So if you tell it Lebanese, it's going to give you the archetype of what it thinks Lebanese is. But if you define what Lebanese is based on your experience of what Lebanese is, like a child, I always use this example, like a child is this being the descriptor. So if I could tell this person is Jamaican, it's going to give me somebody who is stereotypical Jamaican. But if I ask the child, describe this person to me, that child doesn't know even what Jamaican is. What are they going to describe? They're going to describe them in detail, like an artisan would. They're going to describe their skin color, their hair, their eye shape, the details, what they're wearing, the colors, and that is the big difference. So now you're in control of the story versus the archetype is in control, because the data is trained on these archetypes. Sometimes you can use archetype to your advantage. For instance, I want to have Shiva because I want somebody with multiple arms. I'm going to pull archetype Shiva because it'll be easier to describe. So I don't have somebody with multiple arm that's doing this and this because I want it to be in this particular style. But if you describe it like a child does, you're able to really beat a lot of cultural stereotype bias in that way, because that way you're actually being the anthropologist and the actual in charge of the protagonist and what the outcome is, versus the system telling you what you need to be seeing. So the more detailed the description, that is more based on the final output that you want to put, the more successful you are at beating and sort of, you know, deciphering and hijacking the system to subvert and do without the stereotype.
It's very interesting because it indicates how important it is to know yourself, so to infuse the AI system with the Silk Road system, right? So it's a kind of resistance then, act to know yourself and to feed the AI with who we really are.
100%. That's why, I hope it makes sense when I showed the personal cartography, anthropological cartography, because it's only when you understand fully all the different nuances of what you are and what you do, you're able to develop your own point of view and ideas.
Thank you, Samar. Another question? Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. It gave me a lot to think about. I just wanted to ask, maybe it's a bit more personal question, but after putting all this together and all the materials you worked with, the techniques and the whole philosophy behind it, what do you find yourself gravitating towards now after all this? And you talked about like all that you passed through, whether body-wise or intelligence-wise. Like, what do you see yourself doing now, or how does it impact what you do now?
Great question, thank you. So, my line of work right now focuses on 3 different realms, because I'm passionate about a few different things. One is education and mentorship, because for me, a lot of the knowledge that I acquired, and because I work intersectionally with emerging tech, is important to sort of let, and sort of feed it and mentor other people accordingly. The second realm that I find a focus on is building cultural artifacts that are actually beyond stereotypes. So those cultural artifacts are not your typical things that you would sort of collect, because to me it sort of is training the idea of what you surround yourself with, what you wear, what you embody, are things that are not just objects, they're not just disposable. They're actually part of your identity. So how do you care for them and how you position them is more to me as cultural artifact versus just things. And the third thing, I focus a lot right now on strategy and helping a lot of the brand navigate the sort of like narrative between both. But what I love to sort of spend a lot of time on is the creation, which is the artifact, where I'm collaborating with artists, artisans, and like-minded people to create either speculative design, which is, ideas of how the future and what the trends are, as well as physical artifacts.
I have one last question. I think the richness of your origins gave you this freedom to be who you are. Also, you had this awareness to re-question boundaries and limits. Here, our students, they are trained to be architects or designers, or it's quite a standard system. So what would be the advice for them to break free from these limits and not think about design as a one-scale approach, but as a multi-scalar approach and a multi-dimensional one?
Yeah, I think that's also an excellent question, because it's like me if I'm telling you you're an architect, do you like me to define or introduce you, for instance, as an architect? Does that encompass the full holistic idea of who you are as an identity? Because what if you're also a great cook? What if you're also a great dancer? What if you're also somebody who is really into music? What if you're also somebody who basically maybe potentially on the side does ceramics? If I'm telling you you're an architect, I am basically flattening your experience in a way that doesn't do you justice. So it's about reclaiming how you think of yourself versus how you label yourself. I think there is a big sort of shift that you see that even on LinkedIn in professional careers. When you are in the professional world, it's a cutthroat world. When you work in corporate, especially overseas, where you don't know anybody to protect you, your position, wasta ma wasta, it doesn't happen there. Basically, when you work in corporate, you're an employee. You only learn that you're still only a number when you're working in big corporation where there are thousands of employees. Now, if you define yourself as, okay, this is my title and I'm gonna put that on my LinkedIn and this is everything that I am, what if you're suddenly lost your job, which I have a few times, suddenly lost your job? What happens? Does that mean that I lost who I am? Does that mean my identity and everything that I'm about is completely now down the sort of, trash because I'm no longer VP creative of X brand because this is what I kind of boasted and kind of told myself I am? No, because basically, if I'm in control of my identity and how I express myself and how I position myself, it's mostly not the career that defines you or the education that defines you, is who you are that defines you. And I only learned that really later in my career because initially I was like, and everything felt unnatural. Whenever I would kind of give myself a title that's a specific discipline or a specific career title, it always felt really limiting and it felt unnatural. So naturally to me, because my passion are very encompassing, I don't want to sort of be in a box. I want to be a kaleidoscope because we are all kaleidoscope. We're all vessels of multiples. So it's up to you to position yourself as such and think of yourself as such early in your career to inform your practice. Because if you're an architect and also an amazing cook and also you're an amazing ceramist, maybe you're going to build amazing architecture of food art that combine all these things together with incredible vessels that you're going to create. And that is basically your footprint, your unique zone of genius. Because if you're going to be just an architect and there is a million architects that do the same thing, what's going to differentiate you and make you uniquely you? Who's going to hire you because you have a unique intersectional knowledge and passion and know-how that nobody else has? That's how you position yourself. It's all about positioning.
What a great invitation to self-exploration and authenticity. Thank you, Samar.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.